Tonight's topic, as you all know, is nuclear arms, instruments of peace, question mark. The relevance of tonight's topic is obvious. We've dealt with mutual assured destruction as the cornerstone of our deterrence policy for a long time. It's in the minds of the leadership of the People's Republic of China and Russia and others who oppose the defense initiatives of the current administration. The Chinese arguing, of course, that the defense initiative would require a higher level of Chinese armaments in order to maintain mutual assured destruction. And, of course, the President has asked for a review of our military policies in their entirety. So tonight's topic is absolutely timely. Our speaker, Dr. Ernest W Lefevre, is extraordinarily well known. It gives one intellectual pleasure merely to look at his career and the wonderfully interesting things which he's studied. Let me just very quickly remind you of some of the subjects on which he's written 20 books or co-authored or edited. His first book was Ethics and U.S. Foreign Policy. He's written on the topics of American politics, arms control, Africa, the World Council of Churches, the Third World, CIA, Perestroika. And his last two books have wonderful titles: The Irony of Virtue, Ethics in American Policy. And another fascinating topic and very contemporary, America's imperial policies. America's imperial burdens. His writings have appeared in the great newspapers of the country. He's written for the major journals of international politics. His career, very briefly: Bachelor of Divinity and PhD in Christian Ethics from Yale. He worked in his very early years in the World's Alliance of YMCAs in Europe. He was a foreign policy specialist for the National Council of Churches. He was, for over a dozen years, a senior foreign policy researcher at the Brookings Institution, was a researcher at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's taught at the University of Maryland, Georgetown, American University. He's lectured widely. And perhaps the perspective that he brings to his studies is exemplified in his being founding president of Ethics and Public Policy Center, the mission of which is to clarify and reinforce the bond between the Judeo-Christian moral tradition and domestic and foreign policy issues. I'm introducing one of the truly outstanding scholars of the last 30 or 40 years, Dr. Ernest W Lefevre.
Dr. Bird, thank you for the kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel honored to be here. I am surprised, frankly, that so many people have come out and who have shown this interest in foreign policy. You are an example to others who are at home watching lesser programs tonight. I'm going to be brief and perhaps in the eyes of some of you a bit blunt in my approach. It's precisely because you're sophisticated and informed that I can be brief. But first, I want to say something about the perils of wishful thinking. This acquaintance of mine had received a great prize in a lottery, and he was given 3 wishes. And he was advised to wish very carefully. So his first wish was that I want to be as rich as Bill Gates. And immediately a check for $1 billion landed in his hand. So he thought, what will I do for the second wish? He says, I've always wanted a red sports Ferrari. And there was one standing by him. And then he was warned, the third wish, this is your last one. He says, I would like to be irresistible to women everywhere. And immediately he turned into a box of chocolates. Also, when we discuss topics as controversial as nuclear arms, we sometimes confuse cause and effect. This reminds me of the man who rushed into a pharmacist and said, what do you have for hiccups? And the pharmacist gave him a whack on the back of the head. Startled, he said, then the pharmacist asked him, did that cure the hiccups? He says, I don't know, my wife's out in the car. Well, a little bit more seriously, since Hiroshima, the debate on nuclear arms has been dogged by wishful thinking and dark forebodings. I propose to shed some light on this topic by mentioning 5 myths and then responding to the myths. My language will be brief and blunt, and I can deal with the nuances to what I have said during our question period. Myth number 1. The atom bombing of Hiroshima was a great atrocity. One professor of philosophy coupled Hiroshima with Auschwitz, Bataan, the Gulag, the Ukrainian famine, Rwanda, the killing fields of Pol Pot's Cambodia, and Mao's Great Leap Forward. Hiroshima was nothing of the kind. It does not belong in that category of atrocities. Together with Nagasaki, the bomb indeed did kill approximately 100,000 human beings. But those 2 bombs brought a great and horrible war to a speedy conclusion. One of the most brutal, perhaps the most brutal war in history. At the same time, the bomb saved up to 1 million persons, mostly Japanese, that would have been lost if U.S. troops had invaded the mainland of Japan. Specifically, the war's abrupt ending saved the lives of some 400,000 prisoners of war and civilian detainees in Japanese hands, all of whom were scheduled for execution if our troops landed. Not to mention the tens of thousands of Japanese old men and young boys who were ordered to fight with their death, to the death, if American soldiers landed on their shores. Myth number 2. Nuclear weapons are intrinsically evil. My answer is the bomb is not satanic. It is not demonic. Like fire and gunpowder, it is morally and politically neutral. Its significance derives from its uses by potential leaders like tanks, fighter aircraft. Nuclear arms can be used to conquer and enslave, or they can be used to defend and deter. The U.S. originally planned for the first atom bomb, as it was called then, to be used on Germany, Nazi Germany, but the war ended too soon. So therefore, the bomb cannot be called a racist bomb, as it sometimes is, said you would never have used it on Europeans. Nuclear physicist Robert Oppenheimer, who helped build the bomb, was one of the first to demonize it. After witnessing the first fission blast in New Mexico, he quoted the Hindu living Gita, "Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." He urged Truman not to use the bomb on Japan and later opposed building the H-bomb. Myth number 3. The best way to avert and avoid nuclear war is total nuclear disarmament. This has a nice ring to it, but it is simply impossible and unrealistic. The world could no more uninvent nuclear weapons than it can uninvent fire. We must live with these horribly powerful weapons. Since nuclear armament is not possible, and given the existence of significant nuclear arsenals in the United States, Russia, and China, the problem is to control these weapons, not to eliminate them. If the United States, as some Americans advise, would engage in unilateral disarmament, we would be at the mercy of nuclear threats. We would have lost our political sovereignty, and might would have prevailed over right. The real problem is control. To use these arms in a system of mutual deterrence, similar to what prevailed during the Cold War. It's important to remember that the nuclear arms have, in fact, deterred war for more than 50 years. It's one of the longest times, certainly the longest time in the 20th century, where no great powers were involved with one another in a large war, nuclear or conventional. As Churchill predicted, safety will be the sturdy child of terror, and survival the twin brother of annihilation. There was a parable going around during the nuclear freeze debate, and the apocalyptics were saying that we live in a world as though there were two scorpions in a narrow-necked bottle, and in his anger one scorpion stings the other, and in his suffering the second scorpion stings the first, and they fall to the bottom of the bottle dead. Well, that is indeed an apocalyptic image. I think a more correct image of the nuclear confrontation at that time was two porcupines in love. How do porcupines make love? The answer is very carefully. And indeed, this is precisely what happened. Stability rests not on the level of arms, but on the balance of arms. This is a key point. In retrospect, the U.S. and the USSR could have achieved this balance at a much lower level of nuclear arms, at maybe 9 times lower. But this was not possible because the Russians would not permit any form of inspection. They turned down Eisenhower's open skies proposal, and eventually we had the U-2 flights to find out the nature and deployment of nuclear weapons. By the way, I was one of the 3 Americans at the U-2 trial in Moscow in 1960, and if any of you are interested in that, I'm glad to comment on that. The U-2 flights, of course, were superseded by satellite reconnaissance, which we have today. Myth number 4, and this may bother some of you in this room. The most effective way to control nuclear arms is not working through the United Nations or by direct international negotiations. Then the mutual deterrence achieved by the U.S. and USSR had nothing to do with the United Nations. In fact, the political UN is not really an actor in world politics. The actors in world politics are sovereign states whose interest and behavior is reflected, often not very accurately, in the decisions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. Further, protracted negotiations among nuclear powers is not the most effective way to achieve nuclear balance and mutual deterrence. Verbal negotiations, of course, have merit, but negotiations are not as effective as unilateral action. This is an important point. By far the greatest nuclear disarmament in history occurred by the unilateral action of President Reagan when he placed Pershing II missiles, medium-range missiles, in Germany to counter the Soviet SS missiles, which were then targeted against all NATO capitals from Oslo to Istanbul. We did not have a comparable system. When we put in a comparable system, finally, Gorbachev saw the light, and eventually the two leaders of the two biggest nuclear powers got together and eliminated this most destabilizing system from the face of the earth. This, I repeat, is the most significant disarmament of great powers in the history of the world, and it was occasioned not by negotiation, not by the UN, but by the unilateral action of a courageous president. Now, a word about future prospects. Obviously, everybody knows we live in a dangerous world. There are even occasionally spies, some of which are caught, as we have learned in the last 48 hours. What then are the prospects for avoiding nuclear war or nuclear threats, nuclear blackmail, all the bad things we associate with nuclear weapons? I have a few suggestions. And the first is that I do not think the situation has spun out of control. I do not think nuclear war is imminent. Here are some suggestions for keeping the world more or less on an even keel, any of which can be elaborated in the discussion period. First, the big three nuclear powers, US, Russia, and China, must continue to practice the nuclear disciplines developed during the Cold War. And I must mention here that not all nuclear powers behave the same. There are predatory powers, as indeed the Soviet Union was for years, and indeed as China may become. Some people refer to China as a strategic partner. It may or may not be. It is certainly a potential adversary. The second comment I have, the big three should also increase their efforts to curtail the transfer of nuclear technology to rogue regimes such as those in Iraq, Iran, Libya. Alas, Russia and China have themselves been guilty of permitting or encouraging such transfers. 3, the large nuclear powers, by precept and example, not by preaching, should encourage regional states like Israel, India, and Pakistan to emulate the policies of restraint developed during the Cold War. Now, a specific word about India and Pakistan. Just a year ago, I went out to look into this question in these two countries that had recently acquired nuclear arms and the means of delivery, and who are involved in a long-standing conflict over the disputed territory of Kashmir. I wanted to find out what possible effect their acquisition of nuclear arms would have on the conflict and the prospects for war. I talked with politicians, I talked with scholars, religious leaders, and others. And I concluded that the mutual awareness of the nuclear threat there had made a serious war over Kashmir less likely. Now, when people said to me, I don't think the mutual deterrence you and the Soviets achieved during the Cold War is possible here because the enmity and the anger and the emotions between the two sides are so great. My reply was that during the nuclear standoff, both sides had ample opportunity to be upset. Khrushchev was certainly provoked by the U-2 flights over his territory. And Kennedy was certainly provoked by the placement of nuclear arms in Cuba. But in the end, enlightened self-interest prevailed, and nuclear war was averted. In conclusion, again, I trust that my strange mix of realism and hope will serve as a prelude to a lively debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it will be lively, I think.
The question was about India and Pakistan and the role of intelligence. We were taken by surprise by these two explosions 2 years ago there, somewhat. It's surprising to me that we were surprised because India already had a nuclear explosion about 20 years before, and Pakistan was not far behind, being helped by other states. But that is not the real issue, whether we were surprised or not. The real issue is to help these two new regional nuclear powers to behave responsibly, to encourage them to develop, for example, a hot line between the capitals in Pakistan and India. I'm not worried about the inadequacy, presumed inadequacy of our government in this matter. If I could summarize the question, wouldn't it be better to spend our resources on peaceful pursuits, looking after our people, and getting other people to spend resources helping them on ending poverty and so on, and do good and constructive things rather than spending them on weapons? This is a very common thing, and I would hope, and every decent human being would hope, that we would behave that way, and it would be very nice if the world were that way. Unfortunately, throughout history, there have been what I would call predatory powers. And I know no magic way or a gradual way of eliminating powers from becoming predatory. So the problem of war has always rested with the fact of one power, at least one, wanting to get something it does not now have. It is predatory, whether it's fighting and invading to take over colonies in the less developed world, whether it's trying to become the #1 power in Europe. It's the predatory power. In political science terms, they refer to the unsatisfied power versus the status quo power. So the problem, this now as ever, is the existence of predatory powers. Now, another part of the question said, well, if we could spend a lot less. I have advocated all along spending far less on nuclear weapons if we could get all nuclear weapon states to agree to that. A long time ago, this is at least 40 years ago, when I worked for the Institute for Defense Analyses, I was involved in a study for the Defense Department. And the question we were asked is this: how low can you go in nuclear weapons and still maintain mutual deterrence? This was before the age of missiles. This was when the weapons were carried by aircraft. And you may be interested in our conclusion. We concluded that, and then the only countries involved, of course, were the Soviet Union and the United States, we could go down to 200 weapons each and still have mutual deterrence. But again, as I mentioned earlier, this was not possible because we can never ascertain, never verify what the Soviet Union had. But now the United States has 20,000 nuclear warheads. I'm in favor of negotiating that down, but again, with adequate verification. This is a question on the safety of nuclear plants. I'm against Chernobyl-style nuclear plants wherever they are. Our nuclear plants to produce electricity are not that style. It is my view, and I'm certainly no expert, is that our nuclear plants are relatively safe, and I would generally favor greater reliance on nuclear energy with even greater safeguards. That's only a personal opinion. Many countries are heavily reliant on nuclear, on Japan, Germany, France, certainly Russia, very heavily reliant on it.
But do you think in this country we'll ever get to the point?
No. Will in this country ever get to the point where we will accept what I have said, or whether we will get rid of nuclear power plants completely?
Accept the peaceful use of nuclear energy.
Yeah. I think so. I think we will. I think generally the American people, I don't know the public opinion on this, accept the idea that it's good to have peaceful uses of nuclear energy, the chief of which, of course, would be the production of electricity. Yes, this is a question about communication between powers, particularly nuclear powers, so that we don't stumble into war by accident or misinterpret. I'm in favor of maximum communication. Of course, I favor the hotline, in which we're minutes away from leaders in Moscow on that issue. I favor all kinds of exchanges with scientists. Technology pretty well spreads around the world with very little inhibition. And I favor maximum exchange of scholars, ordinary citizens, businessmen. All of these things help. But all of these things put together do not eliminate the principal problem recurring in history, namely the rise of a predatory state or a predatory regime that is prepared out of a messianic desire or some grievance to assault or threaten another state. That's the war problem, that's the nuclear problem.
The question was, if a rogue state does acquire a nuclear weapon capability as a threat to the United States or an ally, what should we do?
Well, I can give one historical example. When Iraq had developed a reactor, the government in Israel just went over and bombed it. Now, I'm not recommending that as a general procedure, certainly not recommending that for a great power. The most immediate problem we have now is, of course, with Iraq. And I think Saddam Hussein needs to be contained. That makes common sense. It's good for the security of his neighbors. It's good for the security of the world. And it happens to be in harmony with UN resolutions. So I think we have to do, hopefully in concert with Saudi Arabia and other Arab states, what is necessary to contain this person. In extremis, and I'm not willing to define what that is, it might be the better part of valor, wisdom, and morality to bomb a nuclear arms facility. Now, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were actually very much a case in extremis. Truman had no solid evidence that they were about to negotiate a ceasefire. So he did, in my view, the right thing. But it's very difficult to deal with a hypothetical future. Very good question about the impact of the great destructiveness of nuclear arms. Suggests they're in a totally different category from most conventional arms, although modern technology with smart bombs and all that suggests that maybe, and he quotes Secretary of State Powell on this, maybe these have superseded in utility nuclear weapons. Well, of course, I would like to see a world without nuclear weapons, but that world is not here. So the thing to do, it seems to me, is to negotiate down the level of nuclear arms, keeping a propitious balance. And again, I think that can be done with adequate inspection. But again, I go back to the fundamental root of the problem. There are predatory states that threaten the peace. And it's the responsibility of a state like the United States, which is a satisfied state, prefers the status quo, to do what it can. Now, one other thing related to the first part of your question, namely in the terrible destructiveness of nuclear arms. Indeed, that doesn't have to be argued. At the same time, the difference is not all that great. Only 2 nuclear arms were ever exploded in warfare. 5 months before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 100,000 Japanese were incinerated in a fire raid on Tokyo. The same number as were killed by Hiroshima and Nagasaki together. And it's a horrible thing. It's a great tragedy. Both of those are great tragedies. But is it worse to die from a nuclear explosion or to die from fire bombs that suck all the oxygen out of the air? Incidentally, also in Japan, 50 other cities were hit before Nagasaki and Hiroshima, suggesting that it was unlikely that the war party, which was in the saddle, would capitulate very easily. And it was the emperor who finally said after Nagasaki, things had developed in a way not necessarily conducive to Japan's good. That was his understatement. This is a question about the problem of maintaining the readiness of nuclear arms. Indeed, they'll have to be looked after at all times. You just don't put them in a silo and just let them there for decades. They have to be examined frequently and updated. Of course, that's true. If we're going to have, as I would like to have, a nuclear balance, each side having enough to effectively deter the other, along with that, we have to have inspection on both sides to know what's going on, and of course, we have to take care of the maintenance problem as well. The lady suggests that the danger or threat of the rogue states, small rogue states, is exaggerated. I would reply that rogue states can do a great deal of mischief in the immediate vicinity, but they also, all of these rogue states, tend to sponsor international terrorists as well. And I believe that the World Trade Center can be traced back to Libya. So you also suggest, well, we could just finish off a rogue state in a minute. Well, history is not that easy and the consequences are not that predictable. I don't think the United States should go around finishing off rogue states. I think we have tremendous responsibility. Pardon me?
That isn't what I'm saying.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The initiative to do it. I said if they did some action against the United States,
Yeah.
we could retaliate.
Yeah. Well, they did do some. The World Trade Center, I think, was done in by Libya. That's my view, and apparently the view of the court in Holland. But in response to that, first of all, it's very hard to prove, but in response to that, it would not advocate obliterating Libya or bombing Libya in response. The world is very interconnected, and we have to, as the greatest power in history, we have to have a certain amount of humility. We have to not be arrogant, and we have to work with like-minded states in trying to maintain peace in all regions. And certainly Gaddafi is an irritant, but it isn't easy to contain him. There are no easy answers. The world is in a sort of an equilibrium. If you would ask me, which no one here has, what I think perhaps the greatest medium-range danger to the United States is, and to the fragile world peace we now have, I would say it would be a predatory China. Yes, do you want to?
I think the questioner sort of had a follow-up, which is, I think, why isn't our overwhelming nuclear power in and of itself a deterrent against the nuclear weaponry of a small state?
Oh, that's a very good question. We have overwhelming nuclear power, but it doesn't deter other countries like Libya because they know we're not going to use it. They can get away with it. It protects them in that sense. So for the World Trade Center in New York, we go through elaborate investigations, trials, and so on, to try to identify some people, like the bombing of the plane over Lockerbie. It's the same thing. A little power willing to use unconventional means like terrorism can really give problems to a great power, the United States. We are not omnipotent. Yeah. Well, I think the gentleman is making 2 points. One is that we shouldn't assume when there's a terrorist incident in the United States that it originates in the Middle East. And a lot of people did that, and persons with Arab-like faces became suspect. I think that is a terrible thing. We should look toward the evidence. On the question of espionage, always an interesting topic, espionage has gone on forever, and it will go on forever. It's mentioned prominently in the Old Testament, spying out the city, and espionage will go on not only between adversary states, but between friendly states. It's a game that's universal. However, when espionage becomes as egregious as the recent case is, when for 15 years an American in the FBI was able to give mountains of information, particularly about our counterintelligence things, which is very helpful to others. We live in a world of espionage. It kind of balances itself out. The world of weapons is a little different kettle of fish and has to be treated differently. There were 2 other hands back here. It's a good question and a classical question. Wouldn't we be better off if we all spoke the same language, or we spoke the language of our potential adversaries? I remember the strong drive for Esperanto. It was said that if we all spoke the same language, we would live at peace. And then when people said that, I said, well, I recently looked in on a union bargaining session with the employer, and they both spoke the same language. So we could perhaps fight more effectively if we all spoke the same language. No, there's no panacea here. We've got to do lots of things, but speaking the same language would not. In fact, I even know husbands and wives who speak the same language. The question is about the transfer of Russian technology to places like Libya and others. I take a somewhat unorthodox view. While I hold in general that specific technology should not be transferred from major nuclear states to the so-called rogue regimes, you can't prevent the spread of technology. No lesser person than Edward Teller said he believes in maximum distribution of technical knowledge worldwide. So when and where does technical knowledge become a danger rather than an asset? So I favor worldwide spread of technical knowledge, and certainly that's true in the theoretical level. It's at the more primitive engineering level and manufacturing level where it becomes dangerous, where you can turn the theories of nuclear science into a specific weapons. I remember the craze that was around here about 30 years ago, and they said this guy had written a manual on how to build a nuclear weapon, and any bright high school student can build a nuclear weapon in his garage, presumably over several weekends. The problem was not the theory, the problem is in the engineering. Are there overriding ethical considerations in determining the use or the condemnation of nuclear weapons? The answer is yes. There are important ethical considerations, and here I would like to invoke the traditional just war doctrine. The just war doctrine says, in effect, that military force can be used when the cause is just, like, for example, self-defense. When the means used are just and proportional, all right, proportional, strikes a chord when you're talking about nuclear weapons, and when the use of that military force results or has the likelihood of resulting in greater justice. So I would always employ those three criteria of the just war theory to the use of any military force, including nuclear weapons. I would not I don't, by the way, I don't expect any major nuclear weapon ever to be exploded in warfare. You may say I'm a silly optimist, but I don't expect that to happen. I think we've kind of learned our lessons. I think there will be nuclear threats, nuclear maneuvering, but I would not rule out a crazy guy like Saddam, who has, in his personality, has some of the more attractive features of both Hitler and Stalin, that a man like that might explode a big nuclear weapon. But the problem of proportionality, the only way that Truman knew to stop the war was this very serious act. Killing 100,000 in one night in Tokyo didn't do it. The other 50 cities who were already hit didn't do it. So he didn't know how destructive it would be, of course. But in retrospect, with what he knew and so on at the time, and the advice he got, I know personally a number of those who were advising him at the time, principally Dean Acheson, I think he did the right thing. We don't put an arbitrary limit on megatonnage. We deal in more subtle things like what will be the impact upon a leadership elite, what will be the short and long range consequences of this act. So, again, I repeat, it seems to me that a major nuclear weapon will never be exploded in warfare, although we have to work day and night to prevent that from happening. The question is the feasibility of a nuclear defense system. It is dogged by feasibility questions, there's no doubt about that. But if we can put a man on the moon, I think we can build a system for nuclear arms. I happen to agree with the Rumsfeld Commission on this point. But there are many levels of deterrence, and there are many different types of things that rogues states can do or terrorists can do, they come up to the shore with small nuclear weapons or chemical or bacteriological weapons. They can even side up to an American battleship and blow a 40-foot hole in it, killing 20 Americans. That, by the way, was an act of war. If any of you have worries about what a war is, an act of war is an act against the military facilities of another state by persons who were backed by a state. So that was an act of war. We haven't quite figured out who did it. But these are all very troubling questions. I believe that we can get a system. I favor regional systems of deterrence as well, but I'm not competent in the technological field. The question, would I, the realist, as he called me properly, favor improvement in international machinery? I must say, I don't have very much confidence in international machinery. What I would like to do is to have states behave better than they do, to have them become non-predatory, not trying to do in their neighbor. Now, one of the ways to prevent states from doing bad things is to threaten them if they do them. Hitler did bad things. Of course, the League of Nations was totally helpless against him and against Mussolini, against Japan. These predatory states did bad things, and in the end, we had to go to war to get rid of them. So it seems to me that a balance of power is not an evil thing. If you have a balance of power, that means there is peace. You don't want an imbalance of power, because if you have an imbalance of power, the guy with the most power tends to prevail, at least in the short run, and he might be a very bad guy. So Woodrow Wilson had almost a childish, at times, confidence in international instruments to bring peace. But I think the more effective way, I'm in favor of all the international communication we can have, obviously. Most effective way is a structure, a balance of power that tends to keep the predator from engaging in his evil designs.
The question is, would you discuss China's goals and strategies?
Well, I don't know what China's goals and strategies are, and I don't think the people in Beijing know either. They're feeling their way. There's a lot of evidence that they consider the United States as enemy, not as a strategic partner. There have been two important meetings over the last 2 years in which the Chinese leaders and the leaders in Moscow got together and called the United States the most dangerous hegemonic power, that it was we who were running the world, and they didn't like it. They may want to divide up the spoils, or they just didn't like it. It's China's going through a very, very difficult time now. Its present regime has not been accorded legitimacy by the people. It really is not a legitimate regime. They don't have a mechanism for establishing legitimacy. And an illegitimate regime often looks outward to solve its problem of internal legitimacy. And I think China may be in that category. But the evidence is piling up that China not only regards us as the chief enemy in the world, but is aiding and abetting other potential states who can give us trouble, including North Korea, Iran, and Libya. And also they're helping Pakistan. So we live in a pretty rough neighborhood. The question is, do I foresee the possibility of revolution in China? Yes. And I'm in touch with some Chinese people who are working on that. This is a two-part question. One, wouldn't our building a a defense shield spur others to build more weapons to overcome it. The other question is a more generic question about, it is, you said it in the traditional way, that we have enough nuclear arms now to blow up the world many times over. That just happens not to be true. If all the nuclear arms we have in the world went off, the southern hemisphere would not even be affected by radioactivity. The only way you can make an apocalyptic statement like that, if you line all people up, put them all in a bunch, then you could kill them off. Nuclear weapons are not capable of killing all the people. That doesn't give me very much comfort, but I don't think statements like that are very useful. Now the question is, if I put up a shield, does it make you more aggressive than if I don't put up a shield? Well, in the first instance, I wouldn't put up a shield unless I felt threatened. And I wouldn't use my shield to bash the other guy over the head. Shields have a function, and especially since we have acknowledged that the Soviet Union has a right to build its shield. That goes way back in the beginning to the ABM Treaty. They have a right to protect themselves against us, and we have a right to protect ourselves against them. I'm inclined to think that if people say you put up a shield, therefore we're going to have more weapons, that shows that they had intentions that were not very nice toward us. If we have a nuclear shield, won't we be tempted to rattle our weapons and so on? I think the American people now, and certainly since the 1900, have shown no signs of wanting to be an imperialist power or a dominant power or to want to lord it over other people. We are not a predatory power, and I think the presence of a shield would not change our character. We're not out to conquer the world. Some people may have that point of view. So you also suggested that building a shield might lead to an arms race. I'm against arms races, but I'm also against one-sided disarmament. What I want is balance so that both sides are prudently deterred by the other side from doing anything foolish. What is a useful role of the United States and United Nations? That was not a Freudian slip, I trust. The United Nations in sort of keeping the peace. I think the United Nations can be a forum and can be used, but it simply never addressed any of the Cold War problems. It wasn't capable of doing it because of the nature of the Security Council and so on. Now in the Gulf War, the United States was used to establish and provide a fig leaf for a coalition of interested states forged by the first George Bush in dealing with Iraq. As I said all too briefly, the actors in the world drama are not international organizations, they are sovereign states. And it has been ever so. And the trick is to get the sovereign states to behave responsibly, and there are a variety of ways of doing that, some of which we have discussed. The U-2 trial is a question about the U-2 trial and its significance. The U-2 trial in August 1960 in Moscow was a show trial designed to split the United States off from NATO. The sitting duck was Gary Powers in the dock, who had overflown the Soviet Union in May 1960 and was shot down by a proximity rocket. And in the trial, just this one thing, which was you got tickets to go, you were assigned seats. It was like going to the theater. As I say, it was political theater. And the Americans boycotted the trial, but I snuck in. I talked with the ambassador, but I didn't tell him I was going to the trial. It was, for me, very curious. It was too much to miss. So I went in, and during the intermission, I went back to the box where Powers' parents and lawyer were, and the elder Powers said to me, "What's going to happen to my son?" I showed him my civilian passport. "What's going to happen to my son?" I said, "Not very much. Do you notice that the prosecutor referred to you as a peasant who never exploited anyone? They're going to be rather easy on your son. I think he will get a short sentence in exchange for Abel, the real Soviet spy who was then in New York." And it happened. So it was a show trial designed to embarrass the United States before the world and its allies. But I was very glad to be there. By the way, when I was interviewed on C-SPAN on my book the book called The Irony of Virtue, the very first call I got the next day was from a person who says, "I am Gary Powers, Jr., and you're the first person I've ever talked to who was at that trial." So I made a friendship with young Gary Powers. That's the way the world is interconnected in mysterious ways. Okay.
Dr. Lefevre, it's been a great honor and a tremendous pleasure. Thank you very much for being with us.